I started off talking about how the invention of money introduces more room for disagreements over property in the state of nature itself. So Locke thinks that the state of nature can include money. In fact, he thinks that money is invented at a certain point in the history of the state of nature. And his idea here is that one kind of good, a commodity of sorts, is going to be durable and rare. So this commodity, which serves as money, and it doesn't matter actually what's serving as money, it could be some shiny shells, or it could be a precious metal, say silver. This good is then going to stand for the value of other commodities in this part of the state of nature. So money is an invention. Humans make money up. Money is an idea. And money introduces more room for disagreements. And the reason Locke thinks is not too hard to see. Because for one thing, sorry, hold on one second. Got to put my clicker in. For one thing, money doesn't spoil. So you remember that one of Locke's arguments about natural limits on property accumulation in the state of nature is that once the goods accumulated start to spoil, that's a sign that the accumulator cannot use those goods anymore. So if you've got the acorn hoarder and their acorn pile is rotting, everyone can see it. Everyone in the neighborhood can just see that huge pile of acorns rotting on the front lawn. Some kind of natural limit has been transgressed. This acorn hoarder is hoarding too many acorns, and it's obvious. There's a direct link between the perception of rotting acorns and the idea that this person has accumulated too much. Similarly, if the acorn hoarder has so many acorns that they can't even eat them all, can't even begin to eat enough to make a dent in that pile were they to try eating those acorns. Yet everyone else in their neighborhood is looking raggedy and malnourished because this acorn hoarder is hoarding all the food. Once again, there's a direct link between the perception of famished looking people and their cries of pain and their I'm hungry, I need some acorns to eat. There's a direct link between that perception and the idea that the acorn hoarder has once again transgressed a natural limit on accumulation. Now, if you think of a money hoarder and say shells are being used as the currency in this part of the state of nature, if you think of somebody who's hoarding a huge pile of shells instead of a huge pile of acorns, the problems immediately become apparent, Locke thinks. If I happen to be hoarding a huge amount of shells on my lawn, does it really matter if I'm not using them? Locke would say no, because in fact, the only use of that shell is to be as a medium of exchange for other commodities. So I can't eat that shell. And furthermore, the shells can't rot anyways. So the kind of natural limit we had on acorn accumulation just doesn't apply to shells. As I already mentioned, these shells are not useful for anything other than economic exchanges. So now let's imagine that there's a famine in my neck of the state of nature. In the case of the acorn pile, it was clear that the acorn hoarder has gone too far in accumulating acorns. Is it clear if there's a famine in the neighborhood of a shell hoarder that the shell hoarder is actually harming anyone by piling up these shells? Well, Locke would say it's not so clear at all. Why? Because you can't eat those shells. You could have eaten those acorns in the other case. In this case, the shells don't actually have any use in and of themselves. Okay, so in both cases, hoarding up money and accumulating huge amounts of whatever the currency happens to be overcomes the natural limits on accumulation. It breaks the link between direct perception, oh, rotting acorns, starving people, and the idea of a boundary being transgressed. Money is a convention. Money is invented. If you ask Locke what is the ultimate source of money, Locke would say it's actually the human imagination. This is something humans made up. And Locke also wants to say that money implies consent to unequal property. How does Locke get there? Well, Locke has a couple steps in the argument, and we can walk through it. If you've got the Prometheus edition, it's on page 30. And I'm looking in particular at paragraphs 48 through 49. So let me just do a little reading and a little commentary and see how Locke tries to move from the idea of consenting to the usage of money to consenting inequalities of wealth. So we're in the state of nature. Locke says, this is paragraph 48, as different degrees of industry were apt to give men possession in different proportions, so this invention of money gave them the opportunity to continue and enlarge them. So Locke is saying, in the state of nature, people will be rational and industrious, but some people are going to be more rational and industrious than others. Those people, as a result of putting greater amounts of work into the natural environment, will end up with more possessions than other people. And then this invention of money is going to give them further incentive to continue enlarging their possessions, to continue accumulating property. Why is that the case? Well, Locke says, imagine that you've got a family on an island which is just full of fruits and full of animals and full of plenty, where it's just really easy to survive. Locke says, in this kind of situation, people won't be motivated to be working that hard and struggling against the natural environment. So what Locke says is, what reason could anyone have on this island to enlarge his possessions beyond the use of his family? Why would you go about trying to accumulate all this food and store it up when the food is literally dropping out of the tree into your mouth? Either in what their own industry produced or what they could barter for like perishable useful commodities with others. So Locke is also saying, if you don't have something, if it's not just dropping into your lap from the bounty of nature, you can then barter with other people without the intermediary of money, be it shells or coins or whatever. Okay, so Locke doesn't think you would have the same incentives to accumulate property in this kind of situation. So in paragraph 49, Locke says, thus in the beginning, all the world was America, and more so than it is now. So for the most part, Locke is thinking of the state of nature in terms of these hypothetical scenarios. But now Locke is saying, actually, I know of a place which is more or less like the state of nature. I know a place where the people are living in a condition which was very much closer to nature than that of society. And Locke is basically thinking about American Indians throughout the Americas. Okay, and then what are the American Indians a point of contrast for? Well, they're a point of contrast for the English people who are living in Locke's own society, the people who are living in a civil society, Locke is going to say, and who are using money for most of their economic exchanges. So, back to the passage. Thus, in the beginning, all the world was America, and more so than it is now. For no such thing as money was anywhere known. Find out something that has the use and value of money among his neighbors, something which is scarce and durable, like some shiny shells. You shall see the same man will begin presently to enlarge his possessions. So money gives people additional motivations to be industrious because now they can accumulate something that will not perish and something they can use to exchange for other things which are useful. And here's the conclusion of this story. This is in paragraph 50. Locke says, it is plain that the consent of men have agreed to a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth. How do we know this? Well, we know this because most societies use money. And in Locke's time, you've got more and more kinds of economic transactions happening through money. And in Locke's time, he knows that societies that use money tend to be more unequal when it comes to possession of property, when it comes to accumulation of wealth, than societies that don't use money, like those societies across the Atlantic in the Americas. Uh, and of course, uh, English people like Locke knew about those societies because they were encountering them when they were trying to colonize North America. And we'll talk more about this colonization bit in the conquest chapter. Okay, so according to Locke, the very fact that your society is increasingly commercialized, the very fact that your society is increasingly monetized, the very fact that more and more things in your society are up for sale and purchasable by money, all this shows for Locke that you basically agree to live in a society where there is an unequal distribution of property, where some people have way more property and way more wealth than other people, that you've given your consent, at least implicitly, by the very fact of living in that society and using money daily, using money all the time. So, what is going on here? Well, Locke is saying that yes, I realize there are inequalities in, say, 17th century English society. But I'm saying those inequalities, if they're not good, they're at least tolerable. And those inequalities, if they're not just, they're at least minimally legitimate. And you notice how Locke tries to justify these inequalities. He's saying that people have agreed to them. They have given their consent to live in this kind of society. Okay, so what do we see here going on with money? Money shows us that the natural limits to the accumulation of property no longer apply once money has been invented. And therefore, we've entered a situation where the convention of money is a governing practice. Okay, everyone's using this money, and accumulation seems almost unlimited. Let's talk about chapter 5 as a whole and look at the overall problem of this very important chapter on property. The underlying problem of Locke's story of property is how does anyone, any individual, know if their ownership is legitimate? We start off the story in a satisfactory state. We've got a state of nature without money. And as a consequence, we've got a state of nature with clear natural limits. Property accumulation is regulated by the law of nature. We enter into an unsatisfactory state due to the invention of money. And as we just saw with the last slide, what money does is render unclear what the natural limits of property accumulation are. Therefore, we're in an unsatisfactory state because we haven't got the law of nature to regulate our property relations anymore. And accumulation is just going out of control. And Locke thinks that this unsatisfactory state is going to lead to another invention or another convention. So it was money or a convention that got us into the unsatisfactory state. It's going to be government, another convention that is going to get us out of that unsatisfactory state. We're not going to go from 2 to 1. Once money has been invented, we're not going to go backwards in time and de-invent money and say, we're giving up on money. Locke just doesn't think history works that way. Locke's idea is history moves forward in more or less a linear fashion. And what he's saying is once you've got money, you can't close Pandora's box, as it were. You've got to keep moving forward. You've got to come up with another solution to how you regulate property relations. And Locke's idea is you're going to invent government. Government is the defining feature of civil society. So we've got a satisfactory state again with bullet point 3. You've got a civil society with money and clear conventional limits. The name of this convention is not just government, it's government that is the source of civil law. So the real solution here to limits on property ownership, property accumulation, and all of that is civil law. So what's satisfactory about this state? Property relations are once again regulated, but this time by the civil law, not the natural law. That's the basic distinction. I want to talk about two things today, Locke chapters 6 through 8. The first is Locke's distinction between paternal and political power. And this is basically the difference between the power that parents exercise over children and the power that officials, government officials, exercise over subjects. Then I want to hone in a little bit on political power, the second term of the distinction. And I want to talk about where Locke thinks political power comes from and for what purposes political power is established. And using Locke's language, we can say the second part of this lecture is about the origins and ends of political power. Why would anybody want to separate paternal from political power? Well, I've tried to illustrate the point, or actually illustrate the distinction, with this cartoon. And what do we see going on here in the cartoon? We've got a dad, we'll assume it's the head of the household, reading a newspaper, and in bright red and in a bold-faced font, the newspaper headline reads, "Government mandated insurance mandates birth control." And the dad comments, next thing you know, they'll be telling us which food to eat. And then off to the right, what you see is somebody with a HHS, Health and Human Services, I assume, patch. It's a woman, looks like a government official, putting a can of peas into what looks like the daughter's brown bag. And the joke is, well, yeah, they're actually telling us what food to eat. And the idea is, in both the case of mandating birth control and the case of the government officer packing the lunch, that the government has overstepped its bounds. That instead of allowing grown adults to make the decision about whether or not to have children, for example, that the government is stepping in and making that decision for them. In other words, treating them like children. Now, if the citizens are children, who's the government? Well, the government's the parent. And not just any parent, because as we see over here on the right, it's a maternal figure. Maternal figure. So if you hear these phrasings about the nanny state or the welfare state being a sort of a female figure, that's the idea. There's a maternal figure here. And it's not the mother of the household, it's the government stepping into the household, intruding into the household, and packing the lunch directly. And you can see here the child looks terrified. So that's another instance where the cartoonist is trying to say that the government is exercising paternal power. It's no longer just political power, it's paternal power. Okay, so that's why a lot of people today like this kind of distinction between paternal and political power. And that's why a lot of people today would say, yes, this is why we should continue to read Locke, because these kinds of power are totally separate and they should not usurp each other's functions. Government shouldn't act like parents and vice versa. Parents shouldn't act like governments. This form of argument goes way back. It goes way back to Locke, and it goes back to Locke's arguments with Robert Filmer. So you remember Robert Filmer is the guy Locke is arguing with in the first 4 or 5 paragraphs of the second treatise. And he's arguing with Filmer throughout the entirety of the first treatise. The first treatise on civil government is a long refutation of Filmer's theory that Adam was the first father king, that this first father king passed down fatherly and kingly power, this fatherly kingly power to the eldest of his male line, and so forth. And the argument is the power of a father and the power of the king for the monarch is absolutely the same. It's absolutely the same. And the reason is, according to Filmer, a child does not choose their father. In the same way, the subject does not choose their king. Why is the child subject to the father in the same way that the subject is subject to the king? Because of birth. Because the child happens to be born to that father. Because that subject happens to be born in that kingdom. Furthermore, God wants it this way. God wants children to have somebody look over them, the father. And God wants subjects to have a king to look over them. And so there's a divine justification for this. There's biblical warrant for this understanding of kingship. And what Filmer is really trying to say is, look, if you haven't got a choice about your father and you haven't got a choice about your king, you can't overthrow either your father or your king, because both nature and God want you to obey the father you're born under or the king you're born under. And Locke thinks this is a rather specious and doubtful kind of argument. So the first response, and we'll elaborate this response at length in a minute, is that paternal power and political power are as clearly distinguished as night and day in at least 4 major respects. And we'll see what those 4 respects are on the next slide. And then the second thing that Locke wants to say is, let's just hone in on this paternal power argument. Paternal power derives from pater, which is Latin for father. So Locke is saying, actually Locke is pointing out that what Filmer is saying is the rule of the father is a kind of absolute rule. Because there can only be one king in the kingdom, and there can really only be one ruler of the household. And Locke says, but what about the mother? Filmer, aren't you really talking about parental power? As in two parents? As in a mother and a father? The thought of same-sex parents or two fathers and two mothers, this is not one that Locke actually has. So let's just stick with his example. What he's saying is the Bible doesn't say honor thy father and disregard thy mother. It says honor thy mother and thy father. And similarly, God doesn't think that only the father has the responsibility of raising a child. They think the mother actually has a big part in the raising of the child too. And Locke is saying, when he goes really far with this argument, he's saying that the duties and the responsibilities of the parents are the same because the father and the mother's power are equal. So that's Locke at his most kind of radical. What he's trying to say is patriarchy in the household, there are problems with that. Patriarchy being the rule of the father. Because what about matriarchy? What about the rule of the mother? Isn't it more accurate to say that both a mother and a father govern the household together? But of course, what Locke gives with one hand, he then takes back with another, because Locke, like most 17th century English people, and I'm not saying that makes it right, is no promoter of feminism. What I am saying is Locke's primary purpose is not to promote women's equality. As you'll notice, this is kind of an aside. This whole argument with Filmer is coming down to should the king be considered an absolute? And is the king exercising something like parental power? That's his point. And as evidence for this, I'd invite you to look at paragraph 82, where Locke basically says, look, I understand that both the father and the mother have a role in raising children, and they are owed respect and obedience by the children equally. But then Locke says, but if there's a case of conflict, and the husband and wife disagree about some household related matter, the husband's word has to prevail. And the phrase Locke uses is, the husband is naturally abler and stronger. That's what he says on page 46 to 47, paragraph 82. And what he's saying is, in general, that the husband's word should carry the day, should carry the weight. Okay, but remember here that the ultimate objection is against Filmer, and remember here the ultimate point is to distinguish paternal from political power. So let's come to the distinction itself. Locke claims that paternal and political power differ with respect to the kind of hierarchy, its origins, its purpose, and its limits. So we're going to take you through all four levels of this diagram, and the point, once again, is paternal power and political power are not at all the same. First, paternal power involves the subordination of a child to a parent, whereas political power involves the subordination of a subject who is a full-grown adult to an official. So, paternal power is exercised before an individual has full use of their reason. And if they can't consent, if they can't understand the consequences of their action, yes, they need a parent to kind of watch over them to use their reason in the place of the child's reason. No such relationship pertains between a subject and official. In both cases, Locke says, you've got individuals who have full use of their reason. And so the kinds of paternalism that you would expect in a household should not at all fly in the relationship between a government and its people. Okay, the other thing you should notice about this first line on the diagram, subordination, is Locke, like Plato, thinks order is a matter of getting the hierarchies right. So order is a matter of having the right people in charge and asking why those people should be in charge. Okay. Paternal power originates in nature. Political power originates in convention. So Locke is saying that paternal power exists in the state of nature, but political power only exists in society. And in fact, Locke says that the distinguishing feature between this state of nature and civil society is the existence of government. Part of the reason Locke thinks this is, as you've noticed, Locke's state of nature has got a lot of stuff going on already. Locke's state of nature has a lot of social institutions. Locke, for example, argues that the state of nature includes property. The state of nature already has families. The state of nature has money. Really, the big difference in a civil society is now you have a government. A government which, well, as we'll see, has its own laws and has its own purposes, has its own limits. Okay, so that's the distinguishing feature, government. Either the absence of it in the state of nature or the presence of it in a civil society. So that said, parental power has its more distant origins in a contract. And really what Locke is saying is, yes, all you have to do to be subject to a parent's power is be born to certain parents. However, how did those parents create a family? Well, Locke is thinking they had to come to some kind of agreement. So it doesn't matter if they had a formal marriage ceremony or if they just lived together for life. There is some kind of, Locke would say, conjugal society, a society here created for the purpose of having children and raising them, created by something like a marriage contract. An agreement between these two adults that, yes, they want to live together and have children together and so forth. That contract is only between two people. Civil society is also created by a contract, but that contract is between all members of the society. And the name for that agreement is the social contract. So not a marriage contract between two, but a social contract between everybody. And it's the social contract that creates the government that distinguishes the state of nature from civil society. Okay, and we'll talk more about the terms of the social contract later this week. Why does paternal power exist? Well, paternal power exists in the state of nature to preserve life. Why? Because all things in the state of nature really tend towards the preservation of life. Preservation of the species is the fundamental law of nature. So if parents are educating their children in the state of nature, it's to get their reason ready. And why does their reason need to get ready? Because they need to grow up and understand the natural law. And they need to see that the natural law has certain consequences attached to it, certain punishments attached for violators. They need to see that when their natural rights have been violated, they have the right to demand reparations, that they have the right to execute the natural law, and so forth. So they need to be educated before they can become full-blown rational adults who own their own property. Okay, so that's one of the big purposes of having a family and having the parents educate the children. Another reason Locke says that families exist is as a mechanism of property transmission and of accumulating wealth in the family. And Locke says, yes, this is actually one of the ways that parents can exert influence over their children, because the children have it in the back of their heads that if they don't do what their parents want, if they don't honor and obey thy parents, they may not get their inheritance. Okay, so that's another way that life is being preserved. Those are two means by which the law of nature is being observed in the state of nature. Things are a little different in the civil society. Civil society exists for the protection of property of all kinds. So remember, Locke says that property in its expansive sense includes life, liberty, possessions, estates. So what is this government exercising political power going to use as its means to protect all kinds of property? It's law. So in the same time, so in the same way that paternal power used education, for example, to preserve life, political power is going to use the law to preserve property. And so Locke is thinking of, well, how is the government going to preserve people's lives? Well, it's going to pass laws about not murdering people, and through this criminal law, it'll attach certain penalties up to the death penalty, because remember, Locke is very keen on justifying the death penalty, so that everybody knows if you break the law and you violate somebody's bodily integrity, their bodily property, Locke would put it, you're going to get punished. You're going to face certain punishments. And similarly, Locke is thinking the government's going to use the law to protect, let's call it, physical kinds of property. It's going to have laws against trespassing, and it's going to have laws about intellectual property, and it's going to have laws about not stealing, for example, and what industrial practices like industrial espionage and so forth are prohibited. Okay, so the primary means by which the government will regulate property relations are legal. That's Locke's basic idea, and we'll talk more about what those means of regulation are later. For now, let's see that Locke thinks there are two limits, and that paternal power and political power have distinct limits. Locke's idea is that paternal power cannot reach the property of an adult. Paternal power should have as little as possible to do with the child's property once that child has reached the age of consent, once that child has reached adulthood, whatever happens to be that society's idea of adulthood. Okay, Locke would just say whenever that child has full use of their reason. Okay, so what is Locke really saying here? If there's a father-child situation, the child really actually doesn't have property until they reach the age of consent. Until that time, it's really whoever it's the father's. It's the father's property. So those toys, yes, we say in a loose sense, those are the kids' toys. In reality, Locke would say those are the father's toys. Okay, but imagine that child, that son, let's say, because women were not property owners actually in 18th century England. So this is how Locke would, 17th century England, and this is how Locke would be thinking. So imagine that son grows up and has some property of his own. And then imagine that the dad continues to try to exercise paternal power over the son, and is always telling that son how to manage his estate, always showing up at the estate at weird times of the night and trying to tell the son how to run his household and so forth. Locke is saying, no, that paternal power is not even there. There's no justification for it. There's no authorization for it because paternal power ends upon the achievement of adulthood. And at most, what the father has over an adult child is a kind of influence or a kind of persuasion or the kind of power of influence that any two rational adults could exercise over one another. There's nothing special about the fact that this is the father's advice rather than somebody else's. Political power has to reach property. It has to reach property because, Locke is basically saying that one of the primary jobs of the government is to make sure that people stay within the bounds of the property law. And that if somebody tries to aggress against somebody else in a state of society, in the civil society, thereby initiating a state of war, that they know they can be punished for it. They know they can have their liberty stripped away. Say they get thrown into jail. They know that they can have their life taken away, say if there's a death penalty. So political power has to be able to reach property of all kinds in order to secure property of all kinds. That's the basic intuition of Locke. If you do something wrong, you may well, for justifiable reasons, lose your property. Okay, so the main thing is not that the government just takes its hands off of economic relationships. No. The whole point of political power is that it regulates these property relationships, that it regulates these economic transactions to make sure that they are within the bounds of law. Okay, so it's not the laissez-faire, the let it be government. That's not the idea here. Okay, so Locke claims that political power ends only with despotism. In other words, political power can be perverted and abused. And when it is perverted and abused, it's no longer strictly speaking political power. It's another kind of power. It's what Locke is going to call despotic power. And despotic power is arbitrary. Instead of judging violations according to the law, you can judge violations according to the personal whims of whoever's in charge. That's, for example, an arbitrary kind of power. And it doesn't even refer to settled and known laws that are in the law books, laws that the lawyers know, laws that the citizens have some inkling of, laws that can be controversies that can be settled in courts and so forth. No, it's just the will of whoever's ruling. That's despotism. And that is the opposite of political power, or one of the perversions of political power. Because instead of securing property, despotic power, Locke would say, makes property less secure. Property in the expansive sense, life, liberty, estates, and possessions.